Anybody in here? I know Jade, you're in AP Psychology, aren't you? You're in Psych 1?
I did Psych 1.
Do you guys talk about Freud and psychology, like in Psych 1 even?
Yeah.
Okay, what do you talk about with him? Hang on one second. So we're going to talk about Freud. We better. He's a bit controversial. What did you learn about him in your psych classes? Do you remember?
I feel like, I don't know, I don't like the father of psychology.
William James is usually considered the father of psychology, but Freud is the one whose ideas have had the most impact and have stuck around the longest, for sure. Yeah, anything else that you learned about him? Did you learn about the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex, or you don't get into that in Psych 1? Okay, you would remember this one, I think. Yeah, Jane.
In AP Psych, we did an entire chapter on him, and we talked about the ID and the ego and the superego and psychoanalysis, and then the Oedipus complex, how boys are attracted to their mothers, so they hate their fathers, so they try to challenge them.
Yep.
And then the kind of same thing, the girls do it too, but less intensely.
Yep.
He was big on the unconscious.
Yes, good. Okay, so you guys kind of like had an intro to what I want to talk about today. So, but for the rest of you, so one of the reasons that Freud is controversial is because he brought everything back to sex. Like every single thing that you do is related to sex. And people, that's probably why you don't learn about him that much in high school, right? And when you learn about him in Psych 1, it's just like, we're just going to talk about the unconscious and move on. Or when you learn about the Oedipus complex, it's like, they're attracted to their mother. It's more than that. And that's one of the reasons that Freud is like, kind of considered like out of fashion a little bit, but there are ideas that we have just accepted as true that Freud was the one who came up with, and one of those is the difference between the conscious and the unconscious. So we've got an iceberg. Here's the water. This. All right, so this is the image that's commonly associated with Freud. You have something over here. So this is kind of like a representation of our psyche, what our whole identity is based on, what our whole identity is. Like everything thought and unconscious thought, all of it is represented by this like iceberg. The water is kind of the breaking the barrier between consciousness and unconsciousness. So conscious thought is just everything that is like right on the surface. Like right now, I am like thinking about what I am presenting to you. I'm also thinking about like, you know, what clothes I wore today, maybe about how my hair is like, you know, like everything that's sort of like in my mind right now. This right here is called the preconscious. This is everything that I could, without much effort, bring to the surface. So I could like say, oh yeah, I remember when I got a tricycle for my 5th birthday, and I can kind of like bring that up and I can recall it, right? So this is like, it's pre-conscious because it's like just waiting below the surface to become consciousness whenever I want to. And it might take a little bit of effort, but like I can remember this kind of stuff. The unconscious is the stuff that we do not have access to. So it's not like you can work really hard to just like, oh, I'm trying to remember, oh yes, there it is. You can't do that with the unconscious. It is buried deep below the surface. The only way to access the unconscious is through like little clues that have come up to the surface, and then you can kind of guess about the unconscious. And that's what you do through psychotherapy. It's why you go to a therapist and talk about your mom and talk about your past. You're trying to like sort of clue into what the unconscious is, but it's never going to become conscious, right? So underneath the surface here is one part of your psyche called the id. And the id is all of your instincts. And it's all of your like desires. And all of your phobias, your deepest fears. So these are all in the unconscious, which means that you can't fully access these, right? We can speculate about them and we can be like, I think that this is part of the human id, but like I can't really figure that out consciously, right? Over here is what is called the superego. And the superego is like morals and ethics and taboos and things that we learn that we should do and we should not do. So this is like where religion belongs. This is where like any sort of golden rule belongs, any sort of rules that have like determined how you act in this world, like those come from the superego. Any concepts of like sin or righteousness or anything like that, all of that is coming from the superego. So Freud was an atheist. So he wasn't thinking like this is true to the world. He was thinking that this is something that the world society has made up in order to impose rules on your id. And what regulates between the two and what is mostly conscious here is what's called the ego. So the ego is kind of like what we think of as ourselves mostly. And it kind of regulates between the desires of the id and the rules of the superego. So let's say I get really, really angry and I want to punch my sister in the face. I had sisters. That sounded like, I don't know. I feel like I should have said brother because that makes it better somehow to punch your brother in the face than your sister. But like I had sisters and I wanted to punch them in the face all the time. So there, you're mad, right? You're really mad and it's like broiling underneath the surface here. And you want to punch her. But your superego, either your parents or your general sense of good, or your religion says you can't punch your sister in the face, or your society, if you punch your sister in the face or you punch a stranger in the face, you're going to go to prison or whatever. Like there's all these different rules that impose that, right? And so it's my ego's job to sort of like take the desires of the id and take the rules of the superego and turn that into action and behavior. And to say, okay, I'm not going to punch her in the face, but I'm going to say something really mean to her. And that's going to kind of satisfy my id, but it's also going to satisfy my superego. So the ego is kind of like always sort of doing this balancing act between your instincts and the rules. Okay, so if this is sort of the outline of an ego or of a psyche, this kind of determines how we develop in this world. So he had this idea that the very first thing that you do is that you form a character. You enter into this world and you kind of form a little personality as a little baby, right? And as you learn different rules and as you learn different kinds of behavior, you start to what's called sublimate your id. So little babies, like they don't have this like unconscious id. When little babies are hungry, they cry and they get food, right? When little babies want to bite you, they bite you. That's what they do. You know, they don't have something that's regulating that. But as you learn more rules and as the superego develops, you start to sublimate this in, and it starts to go deeper and deeper and deeper until you probably don't have much access. I mean, you don't have access to it anymore, but even the clues have been kind of buried deep down. And because you still have the id, you have to learn to channel that id into more acceptable behaviors. So let's say your id is always like, I want to be as lazy as possible. Like my id says that a body at rest is the best. I just want to nap all day, right? But you know through your superego that you should not obey the id, right? So instead you find ways to channel that energy into like, today I'm going, instead of being super, super lazy, I'm going to take a half-hour nap and then I'm going to work for the rest of the day, right? Like it's ways that you channel these behaviors that are not pro-social at all. And then the other thing that you do is you repress. So sublimating means you create another channel. So it lets out some of what the id wants. But repression means that you bury instincts according to the rules of society. Okay, so here is where, again, Freud gets very controversial. Let's say you are a little boy attracted to your mother, which Freud said every little boy is. They have what's called an Oedipus complex. You bury that because that is not acceptable, right? It's not acceptable for many, many different reasons, but it's not acceptable at all. So you bury that deep down, but that doesn't mean that it's not still a part of your psyche. And so Freud said by repressing things, all of these things that we really want to do, that creates unhappiness. And it's not necessarily bad to be unhappy in certain ways. It's pro-social, it's good. You get other things from it. Like you get to have, an acceptable girlfriend because you buried your attraction to your mother, but it's still there. And because it's still there, because we sublimate and repress, those things can kind of like rise to the surface and create problems for us in society. So the key point here is that because we have these repressed desires, but because we still want to live as a community, we are all discontent. We are all unhappy in some ways. And civilization then becomes a trade-off. You can trade off. So we have to live together because part of our id that we want is to be near people. And that's for Freud, it's to procreate, because everything is for Freud. He calls it libidinal instincts. But that's the reason that he says we want to live together. He also says that we'll be safer, but he says underlying all of that is just we want to procreate. So because we need that, we need to be together, because otherwise, like, without, you know, seeing people every day, you're not gonna find somebody to procreate with, right? And you're gonna be deeply unhappy and not serve sort of like the purpose of your being. So you have to find ways to live together with people, but that creates this superego, and its superego is the source of our unhappiness. So civilization then becomes this trade-off. What do we get from civilization that then makes us a little bit happy, at least, to offset the deep unhappiness that we get from living amongst people? And I think that that's part of what is going on in Lord of the Flies, is that when these boys are living together, they know that there's these kind of trade-offs. We need to form a group. We need to like find a way to live together, to be safe and to be happy and to have our sort of social time and so on. But every time they try and get together and organize, that is creating a kind of repression of their desires and their wants. So I'm going to have you read an excerpt from one of Freud's books called Civilization and Its Discontents. So Jane, this is the file that's on campus. And we're gonna do this like we did with Hannah Arendt, because just like with Hannah Arendt, it's not like this language. So I'm gonna have you pair up and read it paragraph by paragraph and then check in with people. So let's just have Sam, Emberly, and Kylie, you guys be a little trio. Okay. All right, so there's a little arrow that says where to start. So we recognize then that countries have attained a high level of civilization. And then it goes to, it's shorter this time, it goes to this part where it says, by allowing common feeling, you can stop there. That's actually where it starts to get into the weird Freud stuff. So it's a good place to stop. So you're going to talk together, and after each, they're very long paragraphs, but after each long paragraph, you're going to stop. And instead of, you're going to discuss what it means. I want you to do that like usual, just like this is what that paragraph means. But then in these very thin margins, I want you to annotate and make connections to Lord of the Flies. So as you're reading, think about what these characters would believe about this, what these characters mostly, this is the main question, what these characters desire from the civilization that they have started to build. Okay, does that make sense? All right, cool, go ahead. I think this will take probably about 20 minutes, so go ahead. So you're reading the paragraphs and then discussing. You can decide, you can either read aloud or quietly, but after each paragraph, you'll have to check back in and discuss. Okay.
I mean, the hunters themselves had their own conception of what civilization ought to look like. They formed a tribe, and it seemed like, you know, once they took care of Ralph, they might actually sustain themselves for a while. Yeah. Obviously, they were unlikely to be rescued because of their, you know, poor fire kind of sustaining habits. But nonetheless, they kind of had almost like a social cohesion going. And it was only really Ralph, Piggy, and the others, and those who kind of threatened the hierarchy which Jack had set up, that were kind of repudiated by that civilization.
Okay, good. So if, let's do some like extrapolation, some pretend. If the soldier hadn't shown up at the end and this tribe was sort of allowed to continue, supposedly Ralph would be killed, right? Because he was on the verge of being killed. So then you'd have this group cohesion that you talked about, right? Would this be a successful society if they were never rescued? Yeah.
I think it's really hard to say, especially when Freud is talking about like at the end of like the justice paragraph when he's like the final outcome should be that no one is at the mercy of brute force.
Yeah.
And like Jack only seems to believe through brute force. And it's kind of like threatening people.
Yeah.
And so while they seem to be like having fun with like this big group mentality and the strength of numbers, I think it would kind of start to make people like question stuff.
Okay, good. So if justice is mandated by brute force, and especially if the individual is sort of like Jack on his own is kind of committed to this idea of brute force, and maybe somebody like Sam and Eric only has weak ties to the community, then it's not going to be successful in the end. Also, what are the tenets of a good civilization according to Freud? Like, what does a good civilization like provide for people? This is sort of in the first half of the excerpt.
Control over nature. Control
over nature. Yeah, good. So number one reason that human beings are wanting to form a society is for their own safety, their physical safety, right? Because the body is first and primarily like the main source of potential pain. And so if we can regulate that by having control over nature, then that provides a very good, like that gives us a very good use for a civilization, right? And so what are the ways that the boys try to control nature? Brooklyn?
Fire.
Yeah, good. So smoke for rescue, right? So they see this purpose. They see control over nature getting off the island first and foremost, right? But then you say that it's a way of like controlling and maintaining nature. So at the very end, what's happening with the fire? It's spread, right? And it's kind of gotten out of control. So in that way, they haven't achieved like the primary purpose of civilization, which is to control nature, because their civilization hasn't prioritized that first thing that Freud says we need to. What else does a very good society need according to Freud? Kylie? Okay, good. Appreciation of aesthetics, yeah. All right, so how do the boys try and do that? That might be a little bit more implied rather than explicit, but. Yeah, Brooklyn?
Their shelters that they make.
Maybe.
Like, they don't just like dig out like a
yeah, okay, good. So they're shelters in pleasant formation. They do talk about that, and they talk about when the shelters have been destroyed, they challenge Jack and say, like, where are we going to sleep then? Yeah.
They all kind of see the conch as like,
yes, and they look at that conch for its physical beauty too. When it first describes the conch, it talks about how beautiful and symmetrical and wonderful this thing is, because it's like this example of like nature's order, natural order. Yeah, Angelina? Yeah, and one of the signs that their civilization is really breaking apart is when they are swimming and they are like talking about how unpleasant it is. Like the water is too warm. I wish the water was cold, or like they're not appreciating the land as much. The other way is if we're thinking about the narrator as kind of like accepting the views of the boys. We've talked about that when the narrator accepts the classification of Piggy, like, or his name as Piggy, right? Like that's not his name, but the narrator immediately starts calling him Piggy when the rest of the boys start calling him Piggy. So we can kind of think of the narrator as sort of taking on some of the values of the boys. And you'll notice at the beginning that there are, I'm not gonna be able to find one, but there are beautiful descriptions of the island that they are on. There are some terrifying descriptions of it, which I think speaks to this, but then there are also some descriptions, like including when Simon dies, of like this silvery moonlit tide, like pulling his body out to sea, and like it has like really beautiful qualities to it. So just an appreciation of nature that then starts to become more about like how nature is going to consume them and is terrifying. Okay, what else does Freud say that you need for a good civilization? Everly?
Hygiene and cleanliness.
Yeah, hygiene. And cleanliness. Okay, so who seems to talk about hygiene and cleanliness the most, or we get kind of inside of his head and he thinks about hygiene and cleanliness the most in this book. Did you notice this?
Is it Ralph?
Yeah, Ralph is constantly talking about his hair, right? Like, oh, I just wish I had a haircut. Like, I wish that I could get rid of this hair. And the other boys just tie their hair back, which the book kind of sees as this sign of like, and we could talk about how this potentially is a bit racist, this book, but it kind of sees it as this sign of like a primitive nature, just tying the hair back, whereas Ralph wants to keep everything kind of clean cut, even though he's not able to. So this idea of hygiene and cleanliness shows up too. Is there anything else that I'm missing? The beauty goes with like art, I think, and creation, and intellectual pursuits. He does talk about how civilization aids in like intellectual pursuits too. Is there any sign that this is happening on the island yet? Yeah, Brooklyn.
It's kind of more like wishful, but when the article like plane or something, and you can tell, like especially when they first get to the island, they're kind of excited about the possibility of what they could like build as a society. Structure that they could give to them.
Right, and so at the end, when they are all like chanting together and kind of getting lost in the sort of like tribal nature of their community, they start to lose that quality of invention and individual sort of success. Okay, so I think that in some ways, Sam is right. We can see this as a kind of successful society, at least in the terms of Jack and his followers, right? And by eliminating the people that don't fit in with that society, they are enacting their version of justice, as Freud says, is a really important part of civilization. But I think that this book sees this as a failed society. So everyone get your books out and let's go to page 180. And then we're gonna do some art. You know I like art. So I can put it on the wall. So we're on page 180. So it says, I got the conch. This is Piggy, of course. Piggy is always the one that's yelling about the conch, right? And insisting on its power. I got the conch, he shouted. I tell you, I got the conch. Surprisingly, there was silence now. The tribe were curious to hear what amusing thing he might have to say. Do you remember what Hannah Arendt said is the one downfall of authority, how you can take out authority? To laugh at it. Yeah. So here's Piggy with this representation of authority, and they are ready to laugh at him. Silence and pause, but in the silence, a curious air noise close by Ralph's head. He gave it half his attention, and there it was again, a faint zip. Someone was throwing stones. Roger was dropping them, his one hand still on the lever. Below him, Ralph was a shock of hair and Piggy a bag of fat. There, I think, is another instance of the narrator sort of taking on the general like mood of the kids on the island. So it's shifted now. It's not aligned with Ralph at this point. It is aligned with Jack and Roger in their game. I got this to say. You're acting like a crowd of kids. The booing rose and died again as Piggy lifted the white magic shell. Which is better, to be a pack of painted Indians like you are, or to be sensible like Ralph is? A great clamor rose among the savages. Piggy shouted again. Which is better, to have rules and agree, or to hunt and kill? Again the clamor, and again zip. Ralph shouted against the noise. Which is better, law and rescue, or hunting and breaking things up? Now Jack was yelling too, and Ralph could no longer make himself heard. Jack had backed right against the tribe, and they were a solid mass of menace that bristled with spears. The intention of a charge was forming among them. They were working up to it, and the neck would be swept clear. Ralph stood facing them a little to one side, his spear ready. By him stood Piggy, still holding out the talisman, the fragile, shining beauty of the shell. The storm of sound beat at them, an incantation of hatred. High overhead, Roger, with a sense of delirious abandonment, leaned all his weight on the lever. Ralph heard the great rock before he saw it. He was aware of a jolt in the earth that came to him through the soles of his feet and the breaking sound of stones at the top of the cliff. Then the monstrous red thing bounded across the neck, and he flung himself flat while the tribe shrieked. Okay, here comes the gross part that we're reading again, if you want to brace yourself. The rock struck Piggy a glancing blow from chin to knee. The conch exploded into 1,000 white fragments and ceased to exist. Piggy, saying nothing, with no time for even a grunt, traveled through the air sideways from the rock, turning over as he went. The rock bounded twice and was lost in the forest. Piggy fell 40 feet and landed on his back across the square red rock in the sea. His head opened and stuff came out and turned red. Piggy's arms and legs twitched a bit, like a pig's after it has been killed. Then the sea breathed again in a long, slow sigh. The water boiled white and pink over the rock, and when it went, sucking back again, the body of Piggy was gone. Okay, so I think that this passage is one of those passages I was referring to at the beginning that seems like almost overabundant with symbols and foreshadowing and so on. So what do you see in this little passage that corresponds to what we're talking about with like the failed civilization? Brooklyn?
I think one thing that's significant, especially in the beginning when he says, which is better to be like a pack of ancient or like Ralph is there, he's acknowledging the difference like of the group versus the individual, and how Freud says that the group of individuals or a group would always like overpower the individual. So the fact that people points that out instead of saying the rest of us, like not simple like the rest of us,
right?
That like takes away the appeal for Ralph in the sense of
yes,
because I think the boys really do want that. At least most of them, maybe not Jack or Roger, but like they want that structure, but they want the group.
Yeah, it's like they don't want to be responsible for themselves. And you look here, and like if the group is offering sort of an appeal to the id, then why would you want to like why would you want to regulate your behavior at all? If the superego is so tiny that the id can be like, can overcome it, then why wouldn't you want to go with the pack instead of like with the one sensible person? Yeah. Kylie, what were you gonna say?
I was gonna say, like one of the things that like having a definition of like for at first it's like, you know, smashing him with a rock, you know, then it was like that kind of stuff.
Right.
It's like painting like full like injection, you know. And so I feel like one of the reasons that holding talks about how it's such a society because they aren't or like techniques to kill people that actually like, cause a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And he's describing them in ways that cause
Yeah, excellent point. And actually that's super interesting because Freud actually talked about those like different punishments and the way that they evolved. And he was saying it's a sign that the superego is becoming more established in a culture, that people will internalize the rules and feel guilt about disobeying the rules so that you don't have to use torture to convince people to obey the rules, right? So the fact that they are using torture suggests that their society, if we look at this not just as a symbol of the psyche, but as a symbol of the society as a whole, it means the society doesn't have enough rules in order to regulate the impulses and instincts, which to Freud would be a failed society. Yeah. Okay. Amberly?
Like the narration in like this whole book is kind of a reflection on like how like their island society feels about stuff. And so like with Simon's stuff, there was like still kind of some beauty in it, like the passage afterwards talking about like how like the water sparkled. But then with Piggy's stuff, it was like so gruesome, and even like as it talks about the water, which is like before really pretty with like Simon, it was like it boiled and it foamed with like this like pink blood and stuff. It's just really gross. It's like that beauty is just completely gone.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's really important too, that it's just like, and the body of Piggy is gone. Like it just sort of like, it's immediate, that we're not going to sit here and ruminate on how tragic it is and how like, how we can still appreciate the aesthetics though. It's like that part of society is completely absent now.
Like it could have been like, it sparkled against the sunlight, but it's just like, it was gone.
Yeah, it exploded into 1,000 white fragments. Yes. Good. Any other connections that you're seeing between this little passage and what we were talking about with a failed civilization? Okay, here's what we're going to do next. So in your same pairings or your group, I'm going to assign each of you a part of our psyche. And you are going to choose one character that you think illustrates a part of this psyche. So what character would you associate with the id? Which character would you associate with the superego? Which one with the ego? And again, I do think that Golding was actually thinking about Freud as he wrote this book, because he's thinking all about human evolution and how people became the sort of like, for him, I think, faux ethical people that we are, but we'll talk about that one next time. All right, so I'll assign each group one of these. Actually, let's just do it now. So you two over there, you guys are gonna have the ego. You three, you're gonna have the super ego. And you two back there, you're gonna have the id. You guys are the wild card. Okay, so what you're gonna do is you're gonna choose a character that you think best belongs to that particular part of the psyche. Then you're going to find one passage that illustrates your choice. So you're gonna find a passage that proves your choice. So one passage that illustrates. So if you say that Jack is representative of the id, you're going to find a passage that really shows how Jack is like operating on instinct alone. And then you are going to, this is my favorite, you're going to draw an illustration. You're going to illustrate, you're going to draw that scene with exaggerated artistic choices. Just like we did with Prufrock. So you're going to draw it with artistic, like a caricature. You can either draw the person or you can draw nature. You can kind of choose how you interpret that. Something in that scene, though, you're drawing it with these exaggerated artistic choices. Then number 3, you're going to find a symbol in the story. Symbol associated with that character. And they all have symbols associated with them. It's like they've got these little, familiars, like a witch and her cat. Like each character has some sort of symbol associated with them. So you go find a symbol associated with that character. You're going to, again, find a passage about the symbol. I should have written this on the worksheet. And you're going to say, what quality of civilization does this symbol represent? So let me be really clear. You're going to have a drawing with exaggerated artistic choices, and you can label them if that makes it clear, or label them with the parts of the passage, right? And then you're going to find a symbol, draw that symbol, and you're going to find a passage that illustrates that symbol in that way. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. This is the first time I've done this activity for this book, so I have a hard time explaining myself. Okay, I'm gonna give you the rest of class to work on that together. But before I do that, let's talk about the schedule for a second, since I just passed that out. And then I also have this quarter's kind of ongoing assignment to give you. So this is our last book that we're reading before the test. We'll do a really chill book club after the test because we'll have almost a full month, 3 weeks or so. But before the test, Lord of the Flies is it, because we have to start reviewing. So we'll talk about Lord of the Flies again next time, and your major works will be doing. I'm going to give you the form for that. Then we will have a timed in-class essay about Lord of the Flies. It'll be another short passage, and you'll have an essay about Lord of the Flies that I'm posting today, the assignment description. But basically, I'm going to give you an option of 3 short passages from the book, and you're going to treat it like a short passage essay. So it's a 2 to 3 pager. It's a shorter one for that. So it'll be very similar to like Coil and those that you've done. Mm-hmm.
So it's a short passage essay. You should reference like other events that happen.
Yeah, that's what we're going to do. You can reference them sort of vaguely, but all your focus is on that one little passage. Yeah. Okay, and then after that, we start going into review. You'll see we have like only a few days. We'll do a poetry review. Remember poetry? That one always needs the longest review. So we'll do 3 days for that. And then a short passage review for 2 days. And then major works is the one that like you guys are usually just really solid on by this time of year. So we'll do a 1-day review for major works. And what goes with that is this oral exam. You're going to choose 4 books that you know really, really well. You're going to make up like review cards for yourself. And then I'm going to test you on whatever's on that card so that you remember certain themes and authors' names and so on. Okay, and then the 5th is the test. So that is our class period. So we won't have that day. And then after that, we start with this book club thing. We won't have homework. We will mostly read in class. We'll choose something short and fun. And I'll let you guys choose which book that we want to read. I am going to keep it the same for you guys in the other class. So we'll all vote as the 2 class periods we'll choose. And then we'll be done. So does anyone have any questions so far about the schedule? Yeah, Brooklyn? Yeah, so the test, you'll go down to the TEP atrium they tell you to be there at 7. The test doesn't officially start till 8. So I always say get there at 7:30. Beforehand, I think we'll meet in here. I'll have like muffins and stuff to kind of celebrate being done and get you pumped up on sugar for the test. And then you'll head down to the TEP atrium. The test down there, it's 3 hours. So you'll get out of first and second period for that. But you know, all the teachers know it's AP time. So people are pretty cool about, you know, that usually. And then, yeah, you'll be done. You'll just go to your next class. I think it'll be after lunch at that point. Yeah. Or you'll take the day off because you're exhausted. Yeah. Okay. So one thing to review here, one way that we're going to review is something that I normally do every year, but if you were in my Healing Lang class last year, we didn't do it because it was Corona time. So this is the first time you've seen this. Hopefully it's not too much of a shock. All right. So I do review sessions after school and this year on Fridays, which is awesome. They're not review sessions. That's the wrong way to put it. I give you timed tests and I have you sit in here and you take a timed essay. You write a timed essay because you're really good at writing essays at this point, I think. But we're not all great at the timed situation, and especially when it's a passage that's difficult. And you're like, oh, I'm not really sure what to say. And it takes practice. That's all that you can do for the timed situations. So whether you're taking the test or not, you still need to do this review activity. You're going to, I give these every day after school. So from 2:30 on the dot till 3:10. You can choose which one you want to see or which one you want to practice. And Jaden, I will put this online when I'm done with class. I didn't put it online, but you can just listen. Oh, Jaden's not here anymore. I'm talking to a recording. Anyway, so the first couple of weeks will be short passage essays. The next couple of weeks will be poetry essays. I designed that so it'll be after the poetry review. And then the last week will be major works essays. It shouldn't be May 3rd through 7th because your test is the 5th. I'm gonna have to play with those dates a little bit. I think we'll have shorter time. Let's do 1 week for short passage essays, 2 weeks for poetry essays, and then a week for major works. That's how it'll go. I'll send you texts now. You're gonna get like reminds from me all the time, like right at the end of the day, like come take the review, you know. But you'll just come in here. I will give you the prompt. You'll write for 40 minutes. You'll leave. I try to grade those the next day and give them back to you so that you have feedback right away. And you have to attend 3 of those. If you wanted to, you could attend 3 in a row and be done. Or you could wait till the very last week, which a lot of people do, and have to do 3 of those. I will also have review sessions on Fridays this year. So you could come from, it will either be 10 o'clock or 1 o'clock. So I'm gonna do them just at these 2 times. I won't have them going throughout the whole Friday. So you need to attend 3 of those between now and the test. And then you also need to attend 2 multiple choice practice sessions. And those are on Fridays from 10:45 to 11:15. So they'll be short, they're, you know, half hour. I was hoping that lined up for those of you who have band or choir, because I think like you guys have stuff going that day. Are you able to attend those times if you have band? 10:45 to 11:15? On Friday? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Oh, okay. Sounds good. Then if there's any sort of conflicts, you're like, I absolutely can never come after school because I have, you know, tennis or whatever, come see me, we can work things out. You'll still have to do it, but just on your own time instead of mine. But that's the assignment. Okay, does anyone have any questions about that? All right, I'm starting today. So if you wanted to come after school today, there will be a prompt waiting for you and you can get one out of the way. Yes. Yeah, it'll go till 3:10. It'll be 40 minutes. Does that work for you? Okay, and then there's the 2 on Fridays too. And if you wanted to, you could come on a Friday and do both of them in one day, 2 of them in one day. You could spend a whole Friday with me. Okay, that was longer than I thought it would be. Did I tell you which ones you are? Ego, super ego, id? All right, cool. Then my art supplies are back in the back. I'll get them out for you and get to talking.